our lecture series, Paving the Path from Language to Literacy for Young Deaf Learners, with our next topic being First Steps. Literacy begins at birth.
In this presentation, what we're going to focus on is that critical period from birth to age 3, a period that now we can really exploit with deaf and hard of hearing children, given earlier identification and the introduction of hearing technologies at ever younger ages.
The learning objectives for this particular presentation are to understand this concept of early literacy, the history of the term, and the implications for practice.
And also to become familiar with a model of early literacy development. In other words, a way to think about a model that helps us understand what this path is from 0 onwards that leads to literacy development.
And along this path, what are the developmental milestones for children from the ages of birth through 3?
And perhaps most importantly, for the purposes of this presentation series, to consider the impact of hearing loss on this process and on the journey along this path. Interestingly, just as a bit of background information, the term early literacy is actually a fairly new bit of terminology in the field. The prevailing view in the 20th century was not one of early literacy, what we're talking about in terms of a path from birth to reading and writing that really begins at age 0, as if you will. Rather, the 20th century view for the most of the 20th century was that learning to read and write was a consequence of development, not sort of embedded within development, and a notion that to learn to read and write, children need to be taught a set of prerequisite skills. So I know when I started teaching, I think maybe when you did too, Beverly, the term that was bandied about was a notion of reading and writing readiness, that there came a point in time in a child's maturation when they were ready to learn to read and write, as opposed to the argument we're making that this path begins at birth.
So there was a shift in thinking, and around 1966, Mari Clay was the person who was credited with first using the term emergent literacy. And her use of that term as part of her dissertation study, I believe, really shifted the thinking that it wasn't about readiness. It wasn't about particular skills that needed to be taught in advance of children learning to read and write, but rather it started at birth, and the process of becoming literate started there. And since that time, other terms have been used, such as emergent literacy, as Mari Clay had used, early literacy, emergent reading, emergent writing, and really all of those terms in our mind are talking about the same idea, that we begin having children become literate from the time they're born. There's a developmental period between birth and when they begin school around the age of 5 and 6. So that's the particular time period that we'll be talking about throughout the rest of the lecture series.
And just for clarification, we've chosen to use the term early literacy, but really any of those other terms are equally appropriate. This notion of early literacy that we're appealing to here is based on the understanding that literacy development begins before schooling. And this is really an interesting one to unpack for parents. Having done some parent workshops, it's quite interesting to hear parents say they're not concerned about reading and writing because school will take care of that, and that the teachers will teach my child to read and write. And they really sometimes don't understand the critical role they play in literacy development that really starts as we're saying, from birth, and that what they do really matters and is of great consequence in terms of where this literacy development goes, that you can't just wait till they get to school to think about literacy development.
And also during this time that there's a very strong relationship between reading and writing. And we talked about that in a previous lecture where we were talking about the relationship, particularly in the area of phonology, around decoding for reading and encoding for writing, that there's a strong relationship between those two skills. And there used to be a thought that you needed to be a reader before you could become a writer. And we'll kind of unpack that throughout the next several lectures and talking about, in a lot of ways, children tend to begin to write, and it tells us more about their reading that maybe had been previously thought.
You'll see us use quite a number of writing samples, and you get an insight into what a child does with print and text and language in a way through the written work that's harder to see when they read because you have the evidence, the product that they produce that you can look at.
So again, when we're talking about this time period, the age range of early literacy or emergent literacy, we're talking about the time from birth through the beginning of formal schooling or kindergarten, so birth to about the age of 5 and 6.
And again, making sure that whenever we're talking about kids, they're a flexible crowd, children. They haven't read the book before they start to develop. So we kind of have to follow their lead. So it's really useful to think about this as a flexible period between birth and age 6. But having said that, we know that some kids are reading as early as 4. Quite, those parents that trot their child out and look, and there you can usually find a YouTube clip of the children that are doing that. And children who read later, but all still kind of within a normal trajectory. But also, having said that, recognizing we need to be mindful, especially as teachers of the deaf, when we're kind of missing the boat or we're kind of off the path, and we need to be paying attention because we're not meeting milestones that we need to be aware of.
So some of the considerations in the early parts of this path, or the early steps or phases of this path, children aren't necessarily reading or writing in the conventional sense. They tend to imitate reading and writing activities using books and materials that have been modeled for them by adults in their environment.
And that this environment that they're in hugely impacts that trajectory or that development. And that goes back to letting parents in particular understand that what they do with their children from birth onward has a huge impact on how that child is set up for learning to read and write. These kind of environmental factors are critical, and that certain things that we do really help set children up. And those are some of the things we're going to explore in this presentation, particularly in the next bit of this presentation where we talk a little more about practice, how we scaffold and support development, especially when it's taking into account what Beverly said about this isn't reading and writing in the conventional sense. Remember, we're talking about children from 0 to 3. Okay, they're not really writing and reading per se. So what, in fact, is going on that we're making so much noise about that's so important during that period that we need to attend to?
So various sources of information come into play, and Whitehurst and Lonigan are two researchers that are well known for discussing these sources of information in two ways: outside in and inside out.
So the outside in information, when we think about a child becoming a literacy learner, is the information that the child brings to the page. So in other words, their world experience, their language, how their world experience has been mediated through language. So if you start as a teacher thinking about those kids who come to print with a wealth of knowledge because they've had lots of interactions mediated with language, they can talk about those interactions, they have lots of words, they've had stories read to them, they have lots of outside in information to bring to the page before they start to read and write.
And then the inside out is the opposite, is what is within the text that bears out as the children are learning to read and write. So things such as knowing the alphabet, understanding letters, knowing how to rhyme, some of those phonological pieces that are more closely associated with the text begin to come into play as we begin formal instruction.
And some of the ways in which we work together is in our own interactions and discussing even the work we did in the book. As someone who focused more on language, you can see how language is a little bit more the outside in some sense, those meaningful interactions.
And I was someone who is focused a lot more on code or the print or the phonology, so taking the inside, coming from the inside out. So again, I think that really plays off of our partnership and the work that we've been doing together.
And this, we want to really stress, this isn't an either or proposition. This is both things matter, and they matter differently at different time periods, and we'll be talking about that. And I think one of the challenges, or one of the things that comes up sometimes in education, is people harp on one or the other as if you have to choose. And in fact, both aspects of becoming a reader and writer are important. That language, that more holistic, the environment, the outside in, as well as the knowledge of the text-related information.
And as we'll talk about in a few minutes, as we begin to explore the model of literacy development that we're going to be using throughout the rest of the presentations, I think it will become really clear too that the emphasis shifts. At different times, the language is more the focus, and at other times during the developmental process, the print or the code becomes more of the focus.
So what we're going to appeal to, as we said in our first presentation, our belief and where we come from, and we'll just be real clear about that, we believe that the development of deaf and hard of hearing children is qualitatively similar or developmentally similar to that of hearing children. In other words, deaf, not different. And so our model of early literacy development is informed by those models of reading and writing development more widely accepted in the field. We've given the references there. We'll provide those for you also in the resource packet.
And also, as we will be talking throughout the next couple of presentations, we'll be talking about the developmental milestones for both reading and writing. And we're going to divide them into 3 phases or age bands. But again, as Connie said earlier, keeping in mind that it's flexible and different children are going to progress at different rates. But again, the path is going to be the same. How quickly or slowly they move along that path, we need to consider that, but the path remains the same.
And also a notion of a model that's hierarchical, that you can't start in the middle. It's kind of that, what's the song? You have to start at the very beginning. That's just how it works. So you need to start at the beginning and build from there.
And then finally, in all of the other researchers who we base our work on would agree, is it's really important what kind of experiences children have. So we'll also be talking about how can parents and teachers and caregivers provide the experiences that are going to set children on that path from language to literacy.
So specifically for deaf learners, again, we've made this point, but we really want to highlight it because not everyone would agree with us, but we would suggest that the developmental models for hearing children apply to the context of children with hearing loss.
And some children may experience delays in their development, but so do hearing children. So it's not different in that regard either.
And again, it's just kind of a little editorial comment here. We said at the first presentation that changing expectations in this changing context, and that now we're really being charged as teachers of the deaf with a new benchmark, that the majority, most all, deaf children should read at an age commensurate level with their hearing age peers. We did say that, but a little kind of codicil to that, we're maybe overstating the case here because not all hearing children read at an age appropriate level. So all of a sudden to say now with new technologies and if we rethink things, every deaf child will now read at grade level is really not realistic. I mean, that wouldn't be the expectation for a cohort of hearing children, especially when we think about the fact that the cohort of deaf children we're working with now is more diverse than ever. More children with complex needs, children from other language backgrounds. We can all list the multitude of ways in which our population is increasingly heterogeneous. So I think what we're saying is we will get our best results if we think about a developmental model that matches that of hearing children, taking every child as far as they can go, recognizing that the endpoints vary even for a population of hearing children.
And with that said, if we want them to be following the same path, we're going to need to use the same practices and strategies that get hearing children along that path, regardless of their audiogram. But we also do recognize that there'll need to be some differentiation, particularly for those children who are struggling more. But again, those strategies aren't as different as we would think from strategies you would use with other struggling learners. So we also use that as a literature base as well. How are you dealing with children with language deficits or English language learners or children with auditory processing issues? What are some of the best strategies and best practices from those fields, and how can we bring them to the field of deaf education, and how do we need to differentiate them in order to meet the needs of this population of students?
And in our view, there isn't really a need, or if we were going to say where we should be putting our energies, are not on designing special deaf curricula. For a couple of reasons. One being that the majority of kids now are in included settings or in the mainstream or with an expectation that they're in a situation working alongside hearing children. So the idea that they're going to be doing a different, separate curriculum is really not on.
So we've created a model. We like to, or a pictorial description of where we're going along this path. So we have our arrow and
limited by our graphic skills.
Exactly. What PowerPoint can provide for us. So we have created 3 kind of mile markers along this path. The first one we decided to call First Steps. And First Steps we'll be talking about children from ages 0 to 3. Next steps would be children ages 3 to 5. And then our final step along the path to becoming literate is 4 to 6-year-olds, and we call that well on the way to becoming literate.
And on purpose, you can see an overlap with the ages because, as we mentioned before, it's not very useful to say by this specific age, 2 years, X months, a child must do this. That's just very stressful for parents and educators, that it's much more fluid than that. And what we'll try and do as we give a sense of these milestones is where is fluidity and where one starts to need to be concerned because we're not on an appropriate path.
It is a flexible path. The general guidelines are showing those differences in the developmental trajectory and the rate of learning. So using that analogy of the path again, of how quickly a child is going to move along, as Connie was saying, when do we get concerned that they're not at a particular mile marker or milestone in the developmental process, but not to be too concerned or worrying families that children are at great risk.
And again, underscoring the notion that skills or abilities acquired at one phase of development set the foundation for the next step. And I think if you've been listening to us up to this point, you would recognize that one of the things we're talking about really as a foundational piece is that language is that first step in the path upon which everything else is built.
And for some children, additional assessments may be required to help pinpoint those specific needs. So if a child is seeming to be lagging behind, there's a developmental lag, there might be a need for assessment to really pinpoint where they've gone off the path so that we can intervene quickly to get them back on the right track.
What we're going to focus on now in the rest of this presentation is the first steps, the 0 to 3 years time span. And in a sense, this is it. We spend a lot of time on this section because it's not normally where we spend a lot of time talking to teachers, because we forget about the importance of that 0 to 3 time period, but yet that is inherent or actually embedded in a notion of early literacy, that it is at birth that all of this starts and that you can make a difference right from the beginning. So what we've pulled out or what we've created here is basically a framework to display where we're going to take this discussion of developmental milestones.
So on this particular slide, you'll see a chart. We both really quite like charts and tables to depict knowledge.
It's the teacher thing.
Definitely, the teacher's in us. So you can see along the vertical axis, we have the time periods. So 0 to 6 months, 7 to 12 months, 13 to 24 months, and 25 to 36 months. As you can see, in reading, there's a check in every one of those boxes. So again, just to reiterate or to emphasize that the process really begins at birth in terms of reading. Children are being read to from the time they're a day old even. So reading has a check mark in every one of those boxes to indicate that it's starting from the very beginning.
And yet, even though we've said this model of early literacy development is reading is as important as writing, and I think you heard Beverly say, we're not appealing to a model where we say reading comes before writing, oh, and now it kind of looks like it does. It really doesn't. There's just an element of the fact that a 6-month-old can't hold a writing implement. So there's just a physical constraint to be talking about making marks on a page when you're talking about children under the age of 1. So in some sense, there's not as much to say about the writing development from the 0 to 3 crowd as there is around reading. But I think the other point we want to make here around these developmental milestones is just to recognize the huge amount of development that goes on from birth to 36 months. I mean, comparing a 3-year-old to an infant is huge. So there's a lot going on in that child's life, physically, emotionally, socially, and we would argue also around their literacy development. So what we're going to unpack in the second half of this presentation is what is actually going on at each one of those markers along that developmental path up to the age of 3 that sets a child up, we think, in the best way possible for later reading and writing success.